So, hey everyone, I want to welcome you to an incredible panel that we have today. It's called Ethics Are for Everyone. Three anthropologists talk shop on ethics in research, design, and technology. My name is Dr. Adam Gamwell, and I am a design anthropologist, and I am the host and producer of this AnthroLife podcast, as well as co-founder of Missing Link Studios, which is a design and storytelling for social impact agency. So I'd like to welcome Amy and Angela and John to the conversation today. And so, Angela, if you would introduce yourself first.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. So my name is Angela Raymer. I'm also a design anthropologist. I currently work in the field of architecture and interior design, as well as strategy. So I work for HKS, which is a global architecture firm. And within HKS, I work within the advisory group. We're kind of an in-house consulting team that's paired often with design teams and do the upfront strategy related to those projects. So excited to be on this podcast.
Cool. Amy, what's up?
Yes, my name's Amy Santee. I live in Portland, Oregon, and I am a self-employed design researcher and strategist, as well as a career coach.
Cool. And John?
I'm John. I'm an anthropologist and innovation consultant. My career has spanned design research to brand strategy, and right now I'm actually working on a really interesting project exploring a controversial big science project in Hawaii called the 30-meter telescope. And that's one of the reasons why I am actually using a pseudonym. And that's something that is often done doing work when the identities of informants can be revealed and be problematic for them. So I'm going to be using the name John.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah, I'm excited to have you all on today's panel. Now, discussions of ethics and technology and design have become more mainstream in recent years with the growth and power of digital tech. Now, decisions made by companies and employees directly impact the lives of the people who use a given product, the service, or space, from mobile apps to cars to built environments. Now, while companies can affect positive change, there really is no shortage of examples of companies that seem to lack ethical principles in their decision processes, resulting in harm to their customers and to their own brand. As anthropologists, our perspective and practice are informed by disciplinary ethical guidelines, like those from the Society for Applied Anthropology, as well as our own personal values and experiences. Now, but practicing ethics according to our ideal is not so straightforward. As with everything else, it depends on context, including the industry that we work in, organizational culture, regulations, who we're working with, and our specific role and the power and autonomy it affords. So today's conversation is based on the idea of ethics as a system of values that help us decide what is right and what's wrong, and the belief that we have the responsibility to act ethically in our work. Our goal is to provide insight into what this practice looks like and share specific examples, challenges, outcomes, and lessons learned. We'll draw on our work as researchers in product design, user experience, branding, architecture, innovation, and strategy. And we will discuss the ways in which our ethical practices go beyond research to inform larger business decisions and educate others and how to incorporate ethics into their work. Now, lastly, I just want to mention that the opinions that are expressed today are from each of us in our own perspectives, and they do not necessarily reflect organizations in which we have worked. To kick things off, talking about ethics in industry, right? And this is exciting because you all three work in different spaces, but there's going to be some interesting overlap that we'll see as well. So Amy, I wonder if you can kick us off and kind of let us know in your own words, what does ethics mean to you? What is an ethical perspective?
Yeah, well, in the intro that you gave, the definition we used was something like ethics being a system of values that helps us make decisions about what is right and what's wrong. So that's pretty much how I think about ethics. My ethics, the ethics that I follow and try to follow in my work, are based on my values. A lot of that does come from my anthropology training, and some of it comes from other values that I have kind of added to that along the way, personal values and things that I've learned from working in design and tech. So I guess a couple of values that come to mind for me. First of all, I think transparency is a really big one when it comes to ethics. Transparency about making decisions, whether it's the decisions I'm making in my work as a researcher, working with clients, working with colleagues, giving transparency into my process, having transparency around other people's decisions. So what's going on in a business? How are decisions about business strategy and product design made? I want to know about those things and hopefully be a part of them. Transparency also applies in research with regard to our research participants. So letting them know, like, what are we actually doing with this project? What's going to be involved? What are the goals of the study? What are our outcomes hopefully going to be? And letting them know to the best of our ability and with the highest level of transparency that we can have. And then other things like transparency when it comes to conflicts of interest, transparent communication. So I think that's a big one for me. Another one that comes to mind for me is rigor. And rigor is something that we're trained in as anthropologists when it comes to doing our research. And rigor, it's not just about rigorously analyzing data. A rigor starts with the quality of your research questions, the type of people that you're recruiting, your entire research design, essentially. And that leads to the validity of your findings. And so it's highly important for us to be aware of the level of rigor of our work and the validity of our data, because this is informing decisions. The information that comes out of our work is informing decisions. And along with that, too, is making sure that we're accurately representing the people in our studies and the data that we're collecting when we share that information with the people we work with. So that would be two examples of values that inform my ethical code.
So I agree with the idea of thinking about ethics as a individual level. There's no one answer for ethics in the work that we do. A lot of it emerges out of our education, our formal training, and then a lot of it is also from practice and our own experience. So for me, ethics really is an embodiment of moral values. So values being things that you hold dear, that are very personal, but also purposeful. And then morals being that discernment between right and wrong. So being moral values means that it's more individualized relative to the values. So for transparency, I think it's very interesting. In the work that I do, transparency isn't always a possibility. I don't want to say that we go into the realm of deception, but there's lots of layers when we think about the client. You know, there's the client who's commissioned the work. There's the client who's actually executing it within the architecture side. There's the client who's the end user that we're also interviewing. And transparency is important, but at different levels for those different individuals. So really great stuff to unpack. But I think we all agree that it's far more complex than a single code. Although codes of ethics are awesome, and I myself am working on trying to codify my own. This has been an amazing exercise with this podcast, thinking about what are those things for me. So yeah, no single answer, but definitely something that everyone should strive for, especially within our field relative to rigor and the kind of responsibility that comes with our work.
Right. And thinking about what our work is, generally, if you're an applied researcher, you have a background in academia. If you're doing ethical work, oftentimes it's to avoid doing harm. But that can mean different things for different stakeholders and people involved. And oftentimes, as academics, we think about ethics as harm to participants and society. But if you're working for an organization, they often think about harm in a different way. It's often based on harm to participants, but it can also be harm to the company. So often you have a legal dimension that comes in where you have the potential for some tensions when you're doing applied research that you don't necessarily have in academia, but you often have in terms of the work that anthropologists do, because it's so fraught with ethical hazards, because it's so personal. And we often get data that can be harmful to people that we're working with. You have kind of these, I think this is kind of getting to the heart of the title, ethics being for everyone. Oftentimes people think that they can be more lax when they're working in applied settings, or they have to be more rigorous, but it's really oftentimes just the nature of the work that anthropologists do that require us to be so thoughtful about our ethics. And so when I think about ethics, I often think about different lenses that I'm doing my work through and different sets of guidelines that I have to follow. So as an anthropologist, I think about harm to society and participants. And oftentimes when I'm working with an organization, I add harm to the client as well. And so that creates a tension, but that's really kind of how I break down my ethics.
So John, I really like that a lot. I think that's the key, is to think about and predict the potential outcomes of your behaviors and your decisions in at any point in your work, whether it's a project or something else going on in a business, client, things that you say, things that you do. And so, yeah, just thinking about that end goal is really key. Sometimes that's really difficult, though, because it's hard to foresee all of the possible outcomes. But I think that's the value that anthropologists bring, is we can think more largely speaking to the types of people who could be affected by decisions, by the products we make, by the spaces that we create, by the policies that we put in place. And when it comes to this idea of do no harm, yes, I think ideally that is what we're striving for here. And we all get to decide, like, how do we define harm? If we don't tell a research participant who our client is and who's paying for the study, is that harmful, or is that an acceptable lack of transparency that we're willing to let slide for whatever reason because we're unable to disclose that information or not? But another way of thinking about it is trying to do as much good as possible. So you can focus on the harm part, but also focusing on the other side of, like, how much good can I do? So being intentional about making sure that you do and say things that have a purpose specifically to do something good.
Yeah, that's an awesome point, Amy. When you originally opened and we're talking about the representative nature of ethics and thinking about ethics being for good, right? It's not always ethics as an unethical, but how can there be a positive spin? A lot of when I think about ethics is also who are we representing, and is it in an appropriate light? Not only how are we capturing the data, but how are we making sure that we're moderating our biases and things like that as we analyze it? And then especially as we go to present it, how are we presenting it? How are we, managing that analysis and representation? Is it direct quotes? Is it modified quotes? Is it paraphrase? Is it photography? Is it not photography? What is it? Because we have to think about how those individuals are going to be portrayed beyond the scope of our work. A lot of times it's not a one and done with a single publication, but that it might live on in terms of product features. It might live on in terms of a space that we've designed. So we owe it to our client, but we also owe it to our end users to really be critical when we think about ethics. And I guess my last thought on ethics, and I think we all agree, there's no free pass when you leave academia into the world of industry, whatever it looks like. Just because it might not be codified as much within an industry, or in some cases not at all, doesn't mean that we don't have to think about it and that we aren't held accountable for it. So that's to my earlier point of it being more of an individual and personal level. It's whatever you're bringing with you into your work that's super insightful as to how you can inform project work and those outcomes.
And actively looking for ways to practice ethics. You got trained in ethics as an anthropologist. Okay, great. Some of that's going to be in your brain for the rest of your life. But then purposefully looking for opportunities where you can make those things come alive. So not just in theory what you want to do to be ethical, but in practice, what does that mean for your everyday work? What does that mean for how you interact with your coworkers or your research participants, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think that one of the things that we bring to the table as anthropologists is our ethics. This idea of actually doing good when you're bringing in an anthropologist who is generally going to be more humanistic and might be more thoughtful about ethics, particularly as a result of our academic background. You often find these orthodoxies that can encumber something that's beneficial for everyone. So for example, it might be an orthodoxy that you hide all your information from society unless you're using it for the design, some product, or for some strategy that you're developing. But oftentimes I'll try to spin that as an opportunity, a potential opportunity for thought leadership. So if we share this is a way for us to engage people. So I think that that's something that we can bring in addition to ethnography, which in many ways has been commoditized by the corporate world. I think that that's something we can also, modulate based on who we're talking to, but it's also something I think is an advantage for us.
Yeah, that's a really great set of considerations. And I love the fact of thinking across this from both the idea of maybe what your organization has in terms of their standards and what codes there might be, as well as then what you personally bring to the table. And I really love the point too that even if you come from academia to industry, which most anthropologists, because you at least get trained usually in the academy first, into industry, that you don't get that free pass, I think is really important. Something that I'm super interested in is this idea of what does it look like in your work, right? So we have these great ideas of like how we might bring these different pieces of transparency and robustness to our codes of ethics, as it were. But let's talk about what does it look like in your work? What are some examples? Tell us some stories that kind of illustrate ethics in action, as it were. So Angela, let's kick this off with you.
Absolutely. So just to remind listeners, I work for a global architecture firm. So I'm not necessarily designing products, I'm designing places. And if I'm not designing anything tangible, it's processes and policies and strategy that would then potentially inform an experience within space. So when I think of ethics and my time at HKS, it's evolved, but I will say it hasn't progressed much. I came from academia thinking, wow, we have to have consent forms, we have to be very official, we have to have an IRB that's going to review things. And then I showed up in architecture and there's none of it. The biggest thing that we have when we go into projects, say for commercial interiors projects, most employees, whether they realize it or not, when you're hired, you sign paperwork that says, I approve for my photo to be taken in the workplace for marketing materials and different things. But that's about it. And so as I've started doing projects, I'll just pick on the commercial interiors realm, right? This is corporate America, knowledge workers. There's no consent. Typically, I'll incorporate a kind of verbal consent at the beginning, but it's not a form. And in a way, having a signed form might be more detrimental if somebody were to get a hold of that, or if I had a list of participants, could be issues with who was invited to speak with me, who wasn't. Well, then people might want to know, what did we talk about? So I try and make sure that anytime I'm engaging with people, it's at a time that suits their needs. Again, if they're being interviewed during their workday, say I'm interviewing nurses, I might have to interview them before or after shifts to not take away from their paid work time. If I'm interviewing people in a corporate office, I might have to make sure that, that their manager approves time away from task, but that it's an appropriate amount of time as well. So it's been interesting to see that shift. The only exception I would say right now is within education. Anytime I work on an education project for college students, or I did a project with renovating a high school, assessing that renovation, we did have to go through IRB. So it had been several years since then. So I was having to go back to something I had started losing touch with. But the IRB is still very strong, especially with children under the age of 18, minors, and those who are at a higher level, but still within the range of academia as a college. So there's still very much a formal element, but it doesn't appear as much as I would like. And so I find my role is actually bringing to the table a bit more ethical structure and rigor to protect participants, to make sure that we're engaging people in an open and welcoming way. Because I will say that in some cases, I have had people think that I think it's Bob and Bob from Office Space, where they think I'm the one coming to audit their job and see if they stay or go, which is absolutely not the case. But they don't know that. And so I want to make sure that I'm also introducing myself in an appropriate way. So self-accountability is huge. Having a kind of standards that I feel comfortable with in engaging with people, and also trying to teach people that I work with. Because I think John and Amy touched on this. Sometimes we don't always work with people who have similar formal training in ethics, and they just don't think about it. It's not that they don't want to do it. They just aren't thinking about it. So kind of bringing them up to speed as to what we're doing and why is really, really key.
That's great. I'll jump in just for real quick, just in case listeners or viewers don't know what an IRB is. It stands for Institutional Review Board. And so basically in academia, that's something that like all of us have to go through in terms of getting clearance to do research projects with human subjects. And so what this generally is a committee at an institution, at the academy, at a university, college, that then looks and reads basically a proposal for doing research projects, and like how you're going to ask your questions, who you'll talk to, the length of the study, what the purpose of the study is. And then they check it to make sure that it passes, like in this case, the university's level of ethical requirements. So it's kind of a code failsafe, as it were. And so that's interesting to think about. Then how do anthropologists in this case bring ethical thinking into the workplace? This is actually just one of the ways to think about that's kind of in our DNA, is because we have to go through this process of like getting approved by committees to do anything, which again feels really weird in the industry because you could just say, oh, can I take your picture for, if you're in here, we're going to have your picture. We can use it for the marketing, right? That's very different, you know?
Yeah, I would say too, for my work, if it's not an IRB, as I've said, that's pretty much exclusive to education, it's actually the HR department. Making friends within an organization's HR department, they can be your best ally in terms of the organization's own morals and values, right? Their own ethics, and then what you're bringing to the table. So I found really good success in partnering with them at the beginning of projects to help make sure that the project's on the right track.
We have to be our own IRBs, really. I think we have to bring this.
I in IRB?
Yes. Sorry, I am the research board, basically. And so we have this ethical training. We have our codes that we follow or aim to follow as much as possible. And then so we can have that self-accountability, like you said, Angela, but then we can see what else is going on in the organization and make suggestions or call things out or educate people, like you were saying. So I do see that as a larger role for us too, and a responsibility. So not just practicing our own ethics, but being responsible for helping improve the ethical practices of our organizations or the clients that we work with, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think it's a good time for that as well, because there is such concern about ethics, particularly when you have things like AI in the news and surveillance and social justice. And so I think we can seize the opportunity as anthropologists to talk about how our ethics can be beneficial to an organization that we're working with, particularly as customers are thinking holistically about the brands they use and the products they use. So I think that's something that's an opportunity. I have an IRB story. This goes back to a study I was doing that was an academic study. It was on the 30-meter telescope project, which over the last 5 years has become a major news story, particularly in Hawaii, as celebrities and others have gotten involved in this, and more recently in anthropology as well. But it's basically a big science project taking place on the big island of Hawaii that's become controversial because it's a giant telescope that's proposed for an area on Mauna Kea, which is considered to be sacred among many Native Hawaiians. So there is a lot of diversity in how Mauna Kea is thought of. But when I was doing this study about 12 years ago, I had an opportunity to do this as a really unusual type of project. And so I got to sit in on a SAC, Science Advisory Committee meeting, and I had to wait for IRB approval to record. And it didn't get to me in time for that first meeting. So I ended up going to this meeting. That was, to this day, the most interesting meeting I've ever been to, and I couldn't record it. And I could only take notes. And eventually, because things were just going so fast, I had to just put my pen down and just watch and just savor the moment and think, a bit more holistically about what this would mean. And so basically, I did this project for a couple of years. I ended it at a time when sentiment about the project, the TMT project, was very, very different than it is now. And it was surprising because I did expect there to be maybe not what we're seeing now, but something that's a little more dramatic than what I saw back when I was doing the study. So I expected people on social media to be talking about it and, maybe some people debating about it, but that didn't happen until much later. So I ended up being the anthropologist studying this project that became one of the biggest controversies in the history of big science about a decade later. And so it's an opportunity as an anthropologist to study something where there can be real value, because generally speaking, a project like this would not be studied from an anthropological perspective. It would most likely be something that you would, as an anthropologist, go and be on the other side, and you'd be critiquing on the impacts of this organization doing this. But before I did that project, I had to be very, very diligent about whether I could do this project ethically. And that meant talking with people throughout the organization, talking with other researchers who had interacted with them, thinking about all the various possibilities, because this is something that had the potential to be very controversial. And I felt comfortable doing it because I felt like the organization was acting in good faith. I had an enormous amount of access to their documents and to stakeholders involved. And so I was basically making sure that I didn't find myself in a situation where I would be a whistleblower, but not, have a real tension between my personal and professional ethics, where I have to protect the client, or in this case, really the informants at the organizational level. And so I basically ended up in a situation where I was studying this very controversial decision without any kind of non-disclosure agreement, which is so unusual. And it ended up putting me in a position where I had the discretion to make sure that I was talking about it in a way that was ethical, that wasn't causing harm, and thinking about my ethics in terms of making sure I'm not causing harm by sharing information or by doing the research or by suppressing information. And so now I'm just talking about it anonymously, and that's how I'm able to kind of navigate that. It takes a lot of thought, and it can be very, very stressful, but that was kind of an opportunity to kind of put my ethical approach to the test. And it ended up resulting in something that's very unusual, which is an anthropological perspective of one of the biggest controversies. And the only way you can really understand it is from a perspective, one of many, but that's actually from the perspective of big science.
I think it's so interesting to think about how you're saying, being felt tied, maybe tied back, not necessarily tied down by certain things, especially on the legal side. When we work with organizations, we're not necessarily working with communities that have kind of gatekeepers that will help us determine the morals and the values of the community, right? So we're having to figure that out ourselves, and or we're subject to the very formalized version. So an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, is very common to find on the work that I do, but it often is just a non-disclosure to the public. So then you have to navigate, is it something that's known within an organization and that they all know, but it's still not allowed to go externally? Or is it that only the 5 people that I'm working with on this project know about it and nobody else does? So that was a project that happened several years ago with a food and beverage client that I had. I didn't know at the time how important it would be to ask this question now up front. I always ask my clients, is this a known project or is this an unknown project? And the case in which a project would be unknown would be things like a business transactions either just occurred or is upcoming, so a merger or acquisition. So maybe somebody's been bought out and they're about to bring in 100 employees from that new acquisition. Those folks don't know about it yet, but they are trying to do their due diligence by understanding the cultures on both sides so that the merger can be more smooth. But for this one food and beverage client, it was an unknown project. And I was asked to go in and kind of observe workplace behavior. And I've since now learned that you always need to know more about the context and also be okay with stopping data collection. So in that case, I was trying to understand who was even coming in the office. There were a lot of people who were out having meetings with vendors out of the office that were on the road, but I needed to go around and see who was there. And I was there for several days. Unlike academia, where you get weeks or months to get to know an organization, I had the luxury of being there for like 3 days. And by the 3rd day, I was actually approached by employees and they wanted to know what I was doing, who was I working for, were there going to be layoffs? And it became very tense. And my protocol that I was allowed to say was that I was working with facilities, which was true. And I was trying to understand the employee experience in the workplace, which was also true. It wasn't an audit of, again, who was going to stay and who was going to go, but that's how it was perceived. And I hadn't prepared a protocol for myself to respond to questions. And so I wound up having to leave early on the 3rd day and did not, complete my full data collection. But it was to the benefit of the participants to not feel that stress and angst of my presence being there. And I would also say that technology has come leaps and bounds in terms of being able to collect data a little less invasively than a floor plan with a clipboard on a floor plan and you're making notes. You can snap quick pictures and have debrief sessions with yourself almost. But yeah, that was a tough one. To your point, John, you're having to navigate you want to be there and do good data collection, but you don't want to jeopardize the project in any way, it can be really tough. That can be really tough.
Yeah, we find ourselves in those kinds of situations all the time. And I think the longer we practice our work and the longer we spend time in our careers, the better we are at being able to spot those things ahead of time. So I think we were talking earlier about trying to understand the possible outcomes of what we're doing. And so, yeah, when I used to work at State Farm Insurance a long time ago, I did go to some insurance agent offices, and one of the first offices I went to, I was greeted as, "Hey, the Gestapo is here." And it's because they were so afraid of people coming from the corporate headquarters to like see what they're doing and you know, check them out. And of course, that wasn't my intention. We were doing some project about the sales process or something, but you have to be able to think about that kind of stuff. And so communicating ahead of time to a manager or employees, hey, we're going to come here. This is what we're doing. It does not have to do with this other stuff. So directly, preemptively address the concerns, name them, address them, say, it's okay. We're here to like learn from you guys. And I think that's what the anthropological approach is to begin with. It's collaborative. We're here to learn from people that we're interacting with and studying, if you want to call it that. So being, again, very transparent, I think that's another way to practice that transparency and nip things in the bud before they start to grow. There's a couple other things that, Angela, you made me think about, other very specific ways of practicing ethics and instilling ethical practices in your work. You talked about a non-disclosure form. Those are pretty much par for the course in design research, market research, branding, that sort of thing, when you're doing research with people who might use a product. So I've come into situations where other researchers have a participant sign a non-disclosure form, but it doesn't have any consent stuff in it. It doesn't say, here's how we're going to record you. Here's what we're going to do with your information. And so there's kind of a misunderstanding that a non-disclosure form is there to protect the participant, whereas it's actually really not. It's there to protect the client and the proprietary information, new ideas that come up in a discussion. And they are requiring this person to sign and say, I'm not going to share this information, essentially, or any ideas that I mentioned to you can become your property. They're kind of signing that sort of thing. But a consent form is very different. Again, privacy, what the goal of the project is, being very clear that they can leave the session at any time. They don't have to answer all the questions. Like all of these very specific and important things to make people feel comfortable, that is super, super important. And what I have done is I have created a hybrid consent and non-disclosure form. Very plain language, not legalese, no jargon, making it very easy to read, because some people do have a difficult time reading as well. Like we have to consider all of this stuff. Letting people take a look at it before we start the interview, letting them ask questions about it. So really trying to make people feel comfortable and 100% clear on what is happening. Another part of this for research studies is compensation for participation. And anytime I come across people who maybe aren't as familiar with research, say like a new client who hasn't done it very much before, sometimes they think we can ask people to do work for free. And that's what not paying people comes down to, is let's have them tell us information and do work for us for free. And so kind of being like, compensation is a standard practice. The standard rate is XYZ. That's what we should pay people. And really making sure that the rationale for that kind of thing is very clear so that you can get the budget to do that sort of thing. And so this speaks for only certain types of research, I suppose. Design research, consumer research, market research, that sort of thing. People are used to getting paid, but not just paying them financially or with some other kind of incentive, but compensating them in the right amount. So, $100 an hour, that's really not that much money when it comes down to things, but a lot of people think that's a lot, but that's also a very common rate. So kind of adhering to these best practices and teaching others that we should be doing these things. This also, I think, relates to our impact on colleagues and teams. So let's say we're on a large research team or design team, or maybe we are embedded as a researcher on a product team. We can instill practices into that team. So it's not just us kind of trying to do what we can, but educating others about how they can bring ethics and ethical decision into their own work. So this might mean creating specific processes around decision making. It might mean, kind of discussing what does ethics look like as we're building this product, how decisions are made, what we're actually building. Is it ethical to build this thing? Some teams out there in certain companies end up building things that are questionable in terms of the ways in which they benefit the intended user of that thing versus how they might benefit a company. There's such thing as a dark pattern. Technology companies use dark patterns in their products to get users to do things that they don't realize that they're doing. So being able to notice what those things are, call them out, kind of take a stand. And that's what we have this training and this expertise that we can bring to the table. I know that when I was early into my career, my first job being at the insurance company, I had all this training, but I didn't feel like I had the power to really use it necessarily. And so if I could go back, I would do some things differently. I would be more transparent about the projects that I'm doing. I would try to kind of take more of a stand and be like, hey, maybe we should do things this way, because if we don't, we're going to negatively impact these people with this particular decision we're making. So taking that stand it's very important. Again, we're all talking about this in terms of it being our responsibility because we're aware of ethics and how they can be used. So yeah, super, super important.
Yeah, and that gets me to think about the importance of managing up. Often as anthropologists, we find ourselves in a situation, if we're doing a lot of work for maybe a big 3 or big 4 consultancy, you could find yourself in a situation where you have to push back a bit. And you'll find yourself dealing with a bit of a culture clash as anthropologists working in kind of this high stakes, high ego, big ego, type A personality organization. So, you learn a few things along the way. Learning how to manage up in a tactful way. It's not a problem often to push back more than you think you can. And, getting a sense of the organization before you do any work for them. So very often you have a lot more leeway than you realize. Maybe you can turn down a project if it's not something that aligns with your ethical guidelines. Maybe you can modify a project and address some of the orthodoxies that are making this something that is problematic from an ethical standpoint for you. One of the things that I learned how to do is write a consent form very quickly. So, for example, you might be working on a project and you have your interview, your first interview in 5 minutes, and you're working with somebody who's leading the project, and you're working under this assumption that there is a consent form. And you're being told, yeah, we have the consent form. We got the consent form before the interview. And then what you're handed is a non-disclosure agreement with no consent at all. So you have a couple minutes to write your consent form. So that's something that I think any anthropologist working in business should learn how to do very, very quickly. Another thing that I've been thinking about that came up is this idea of a Gestapo moment or a Bob and Bob from Office Space moment, where we are collecting data, but we're often doing it with people who are vulnerable in some kind of way. So I did a project that was a cultural merger or acquisition type of project. For the company getting acquired, it was a merger. For the company doing the acquiring, it was an acquisition. And if you've ever done this kind of work, you realize that the people who are in the know very often are the CEO's secretaries. And we had an interview with the secretary of the CEO who was leading a company that was being acquired. And, being very rigorous and professional. And she broke down because she wouldn't be staying at the company after 20-something years of being there. And so it's important to remember humanity when you're doing this kind of work. You need to be, ethical. You need to use, very ethical methods, very clinical, very often, or very hygienic approaches to research. So there's the tendency to be cold, but very often you have to remember that you're an outsider coming in. Sometimes people are maybe losing their jobs as a result of maybe what's going on, maybe not a direct result of your work, but remembering that humanity can be very, very difficult when you're so focused on getting data. So that's another aspect that I've learned over the years, just how to maintain your humanity, because very often you'll have people who are willing to talk to you, even if it's not within an organizational setting like a merger. It could just be people who are talking with you about their lives. You're doing some generative research, and they just want someone to talk to. I mean, I've been in situations where people are sharing things that their best friends don't know, very personal things. And so that's something that you have to really consider, not just handling the data very responsibly, but also your demeanor as you're working with people and being there for people when you need them while you are collecting data rigorously.
That's a really great point. And I think, what I hear you touching on, and all three of you actually, as we're going through what these practices look like in each of your contexts and each of your different work environments, is that can be incredibly challenging to both find your guns and stick to them. Especially because how we define our ethics is one thing, but then how we're able to stick to it and like when they come into play is context dependent in its own level, right? Again, if you're working with a giant consulting firm or a small design research firm or a mom and pop shop, the power dynamics are very different, right? How much power and autonomy and leeway you have as the researcher or the anthropologist who isn't a researcher, but you're just doing work, whether as a designer and you have an anthropology background, like how and when you can pull out the anthropological card, again, depends on what position and place that you yourself are also in. And John, you make an interesting point too of like that when you find certain organizations that are bigger or they have this sort of alpha tendency, then there may be a less ethical interest in that you may find yourself pushing back more, right? Or Angela and Amy, you both kind of said too, there's this idea that, an anthropologist of what we are in organizations is not always clear. So people think we're the Gestapo, right? We're there to like actually figure out if they're going to get fired or not. And that's imagine, think about that. Like, again, speaking of empathy, right? That's a terrifying thought to think someone comes in the organization. It's funnier when it's Bob from Office Space, but when it's not, it's a terrifying idea, So kind of like the third realm I'd love to kind of go through, and we've kind of begun bringing ourselves into this area, the challenges that we face, right? We're thinking about the opportunities and constraints of putting ethics into practice, right? And so either challenges we've seen in organizations, which some of you've already kind of said, but like, I think another way to think about this too is like, how do we deal with these things like power dynamics, right? And what compromises do we sometimes have to make, right? We need to stay employed. We need to support our families. We have to be aware of legal implications. We have to make sure that the client is happy, that the respondents are happy, right? It's a lot of things to manage. So I'd love to kind of broach this realm. And so John, maybe you can kick us off in this area. And how do we like think about opportunities and constraints in this space of kind of ethical challenge?
Sure. Well, very often the constraints that we're dealing with aren't necessary. They're artificial, they're orthodoxical. And one example would be a non-disclosure agreement. In cases where you have a good enough relationship with the organization that you're working with, as I did with a big science project, I didn't need a non-disclosure agreement, but I also had to think about how do I make sure I'm not doing harm by doing the research. So that meant I'm not interfering in the work of the people involved with this project, but also how do I make sure I'm not doing harm by sharing information or suppressing information. So I'm not censoring myself. So that's something that has kind of manifested itself in me talking about the work publicly and making my data available, which aren't problematic, but doing so anonymously. And it's not so much because of the data that's being shared, it's because of the society that we live in, where very often data will be misused and misconstrued, taken out of context, so that either side on this controversy that's become very hyperbolic could misuse my data. So I have to be very thoughtful about how that's used, how it is released publicly. I'm very careful about social media and that kind of thing. And also, realizing that some orthodoxies, like the pace of a project, there's some flexibility there. So for example, if you're working with traditional management type of organization, consultancy, you will be on a very, very fast timeline. And that makes a lot of sense because traditionally the work that consultants have done has been very linear. So you can often just grind through the work to get it done faster. When you have to think about the work, you have to think through it. very often you need time to think about how to do this in the way that's going to be ethical and just possible. So there was a case when we were doing a project, and this was my very first project at a very large firm. We were doing this project on high school students. So some of them would be minors, like 17 and 16. And as a result of a very ambitious schedule, the manager wanted to collect data as quickly as possible. And there was some tension because she wanted to do the research, but she didn't feel the need for a consent form. And so we thought through this a bit, and it was my first project, but I was being as tactful as possible, pushing back, because I really was there to be an anthropologist, and that was my wheelhouse. So you do feel comfortable pushing back, or you should feel comfortable, even if you think that it might give you a reputation of being difficult. You just have to learn how to do it in a way that is tactful. And so we thought through it a lot. We wanted to do start the research in a couple of days. One reason was to let the client know that we're on it, and keep a schedule that was kind of like you would expect from an organization like this. And so I was pushing back, and we were thinking through how to do the work. So that's often what it comes down to, is getting to the nuts and bolts of what you're actually doing. And so when we were thinking about it, we realized that we didn't really need to record people, because we had somebody on the team who could take really diligent and comprehensive notes. And so that addressed the problem to a degree, but we still needed some kind of consent form, despite the fact that we weren't going to be recording them digitally. And so what we did was, I just took it on myself to find a way to address this. So I went through, I talked to people in the organization, throughout the organization, see what we usually do in these kinds of situations. And very often you're doing nonlinear types of projects. There's not, there's not something that's done in the past. So you might find yourself in a situation where you feel like you have to reinvent the wheel, which can take way too much time and be really problematic. But I was thinking about the organization and the kind of work it does, realizing that they probably have a lot of documents that need signatures. So I went on to their intranet and did a search for DocuSign. And I realized this organization had DocuSign. It was already set up. You could very easily plug in a consent form that you write into the DocuSign platform, and then get a signature very, very easily. And so since these were remote studies, we were able to get the consent form very easily to the participants and their parents and get signatures. And that was something that people within the unit that I was working in didn't even know about. And so that was something where this constraint actually made for a much better study, because we were so efficient getting those consent forms, and also just thinking through the kinds of methods we were using to collect data. Because sometimes really diligent notes could be better than recording it digitally. So that's how I've thought about some of the problems. Another issue that I've faced in the past was another orthodoxy, and it was very often you'll find yourself in a situation where it seems like the best way to collect data is to not be completely transparent about the fact that you're collecting data for a study. And oftentimes that's not the case. So I remember I was doing a study for a luxury car company, and the idea was to go to the dealership, do some observations with people, have some conversations with salespeople, and collect data that way. So not necessarily talking about the fact that you were doing a study, but you were kind of, a shopper or browsing, and being somewhat clandestine about your intentions. But I pushed back a bit and I said, well, why don't I just tell them I'm doing a study? And what that ended up manifesting itself as is the salespeople wanting to talk to me because this is something that could help the organization, talking, showing me pictures on their cell phone, how things are done, probably leaving me a tour of the whole facility, introducing me to the manager so I can interview with him, having an enormous amount of freedom. So I'm not having to be secretive about my intentions and being on a showroom and trying to overhear people, but just being outright and saying, hey, would you like to talk about this for, a gift card to a coffee shop, the coffee shop I'm talking about earlier, that, basically getting data by being completely transparent ended up being the best way to collect data for that particular study. So very often you can think about what you're actually doing and kind of tackle some of those orthodoxies that might lead you in a direction that's less ethical, but very often being as ethical as possible can end up being better for everybody.
I love that.
Yeah, that's so good. It makes me think about, at the beginning we talked about how ethics doesn't always have to be unethical. Like, how can ethics be in the best service for your work and for your participants and ultimately your client? In terms of challenges, but challenges for the better, I'll continue that theme we've got going on right now. I had a food retailer client on the East Coast, and they had a regional headquarters. So they were moving from a very old, dated, dare I say, kind of abandoned feeling kind of space. And their new space, which we were designing, was going to be everything it wasn't, right? Not old, not abandoned. But at the outset, I felt my responsibility to remind the design team, yes, their situation is really poor right now, but what we shouldn't do is think about, well, it doesn't matter what we give them because anything will be better than what they have. Like, that doesn't feel right. I mean, I couldn't maybe put it in ethical terms, but it just seemed like a disservice to the project opportunity and to the people to say, well, it doesn't really matter. Anything will be better. I mean, that is true. The working environment of these individuals, mostly in windowless rooms. I mean, they were amazing people that deserved such a better space for their workplace experience. But we laid that out pretty early on in the project, was that this is meant to be a space for these people, for this portion of the organization to really like blossom and grow and be everything that they already are, but better. And so in terms of engaging them and applying ethics to that, a lot of people were very uncomfortable and they weren't very proud of their workspace. So when I did go do on-site observation and I did photo documentation, first I had to get an okay that it was okay to document current state. This is an organization that is well known that probably wouldn't be, very proud of sharing their current state without also sharing what their future state would be. But they agreed, and their only request was that we leave out employees. So we asked anytime I would come through and take pictures of workstations or offices or the break room, that I would just kindly ask, whenever there's a pause in what you're doing, would you mind stepping to the side? And then that way it wasn't compromising individuals. And in my opinion, for this one project, it also helped the design team focus on the space, less about, well, what do the people look like that are using the space and how many people bring lunch boxes versus order out, like those kinds of things get distracting. So it was really great to be able to tell the story and have the photos of the spaces. But at the same time, we didn't want to exclude them from being able to give input. And so what we did was we did a survey with them. They were very open to it. And we did a survey to everyone in the office. I would say about 70% of people took it. And then of everyone who was invited to take it, the whole office, we did follow-up focus groups. And we brought the survey data in to inform the conversations. And people could either align and continue thoughts they had shared in the survey. They could rebut certain things, share their perspective. So I found that super rewarding for a project to be balancing the ethics in terms of maybe protecting where that needed to happen and buffering a few things, but still inviting to the conversation. And then the ultimate goal is that these people will move into their new space and be so excited for it because it's for them, right? It's not just this generic office, anything will be better than what they have, but it's designed to meet their needs and kind of their culture as an organization. So really loved that, but there were challenges with how the data was collected. And as we move into kind of marketing of this, how that story is portrayed. But I'm excited to be a part of that process too.
I think organizational culture is probably one of the top challenges. And that has been true for me in so many ways over many, many years. We all find ourselves in these different contexts with different organizational cultures, and they can be pretty extreme in certain situations. John, I love the word you used, orthodoxies, where people just cling to a thing because that's how it's done and no one's kind of offered up a different way of doing things. What we have is a choice to decide how we're going to be ethical in our own jobs. We have a choice as to how do we want to make waves or rock the boat? Do we not want to? Do we want to just do a little bit here and there? So the degree to which we're trying to have an impact and educate others, we can all reflect on what we value most and what our priorities are. So maybe our family is the most important thing and that paycheck and, kind of just having consistent work, a job you like, without stepping on people's toes. That might be a very real situation for a lot of people. It could be that you prioritize the people who use the product like fully. And while you're there working at a company, and yes, you are there to do a job and help meet company goals, like that can be your true focus. And that could present some issues as well. If you can't practice ethics to another person's ethical standards, that's okay. You're not a bad person. I think as long as you're trying your best and you're aware of it and being purposeful, then that's what's required. But oftentimes that is not the case, for many people. I think a lot of what this looks like too is challenging, again, some of those orthodoxies. One I thought of is a lot of big companies see people as numbers. Like people are numbers when it comes to an organizational goal, a quarterly goal, a stock market price, a metric, an analytic. And anthropologists bring this like revolutionary idea that people are humans and they're much more complex, and you can't just boil them down to numbers. At least ethically, that might not be a good idea. Scientifically, informationally speaking, that's not really a good idea either. But when you push back on that and you try to remind people that there are people we should listen to make a decision, like before we do something, let's ask these employees what they think. Let's make sure we talk to these teams. Let's make sure we spoke with all the possible people who might use this product. That is a challenge to the notion that people are numbers, because we're introducing more information that makes things more complicated for people. And it's hard to, I think, sometimes step outside of this direction you're going in of just kind of trying to achieve the goals that are on your list. So I think that's another way we could look at it. And this requires us to challenge the things that aren't working, to maybe with different communication channels or ways of communicating. There are hierarchies in these organizations, in many of them. Obviously, that's kind of the traditional way of doing business, is you have a CEO and then you have executives and then you have directors and managers and, people on down the line, as they say. But is it okay if you just go straight to this really high up person? Is that okay? Is that not okay? Does it matter? Do you just do it anyway? Do you get your, wrist slapped? I have had my wrist slapped many, many times for something like that, but it's kind of, I think it will be the most impactful way to get something done, or I feel that it's too important to let something slide or to let something be not known. And by doing that stuff, we are exemplifying that things can be different. So, the pushing back, the challenging of hierarchy, the challenge towards company goals. Like, why is this our goal? Maybe it's better to have this other goal for whatever reason. And then someone mentioned delivery. I think, John, you were talking about the way you deliver things. That is really important. You do have to kind of find a balance. That's a struggle for me, at least in my past jobs working inside of large companies. I have felt very passionately about stuff, and I have had to learn a lot about how to communicate things, which battles to choose. And that's why I like being self-employed, is because I have a lot more control over this stuff. Again, which projects do I take? Who do I work with? What kind of products do I work on? All that stuff. So that's just what suits me best, versus other people who are really, really skilled at doing this kind of thing inside of companies. So yeah, having a balance, maybe making some compromises. Sometimes that's okay if you don't always live up to the standards that you've set for yourself.
Yeah, so I just want to say, so Amy, Angela, and John, thanks. This has been an amazing conversation, super enlightening. I've learned a ton from you all today, and there's so much more that we can go with. There's so much baggage to unpack, or so many tools to build. Right? I know. I agree with you, Angela. Like let's call them toolkit, or baggage, anti-gravity baggage, maybe, or something that way. It's like.
I think the most important tool is having a red stapler always.
That is correct. And
it comes back to Office Space.
To carry home the Office Space theme.
Fantastic. Well, everybody, thanks for tuning in. My name is Adam Gamwell, and we are now going to turn it over to a live audience Q&A. So stick around. We have your questions we'll be collecting from the Mindshare forum, and we'll get into it.
Cool. Hey, folks. Thanks for joining us for the panel discussion. We're all appearing now. Look, we had a wardrobe change, I guess. We're going to it's sweaty work doing a panel, so we had to change real quick. I'm just collecting the questions from the Mindshare form, so thank you. Feel free to keep sending them in as they come up, and we'll just kind of go a bit in order and go through really, really awesome questions and conversations that have been put forth so far. So just to kick it off, Alba put a question that asks us, how do you think about or think through or prioritize potentially conflicting ethical values, right? This is something that came up in our conversation today as well, such as protecting user privacy versus like a company's need for transparency. And so it sounds like based on what we heard, maybe Angela, if you've seen this kind of working in HKS, have you had to deal with these like potentially conflicting values sometimes?
Yeah. So I was scribbling notes on the side. So as I read, it's because I wanted to have my thoughts together to answer more coherently. But a fabulous question. Really thinking through, there are going to be conflicts and maybe even conflicts of interest within the request for work and then how the work is fulfilled. The idea is that you don't want to extract. That just feels so harsh, right? So you're really inviting people to have a voice. You'd hope that their participation is a form of empowerment to have a voice as opposed to just assumptions based on HR stats and the like. But what I found really successful is to have a couple plans in place when you are negotiating kind of the scope and the approach with a client. So one thing is identifying the population that you're going to be engaging with and the level of access you're going to have with them. So is it just high-level managers? Why just high-level managers? Why not somebody else? And talk through that a little bit. How you might be sharing the communication pieces back, if they are in fact going to be dispersed within the organization or at large. So one of the things that we negotiate is a communication plan. So thinking through quite literally, to what extent is it just going to the executives? Is it going to managers? Is it going to the organization? Is it something that's going to be published as a white paper? So really thinking through the end game, so that way if there are issues, you can work through it ahead of time, as opposed to doing all this great work and then finding out, they're nervous to share it externally, they're going to put it on a shelf and it's going to disappear. Because that to me is a real shame when you go through the effort of inviting people to give input and feedback and share their stories, and for it to not have any output, as it were, any voice outside of that effort. So I would say communication plan, and like I said, just identifying who's going to be able to be spoken with and getting them to say why is a really important thing. And it might not be that something you do today. They might only want to engage mid-level managers today. And if you push back and say why, and they tell you, then you can offer, hey, maybe in 6 months when I'll pick on mergers and acquisitions again, when the mergers and acquisitions are known, then can you engage others? So it doesn't have to be a finite point in time where you're either included or you're not. It's just a few things I would say.
Cool. And Amy, John, do you want to tag into this? Or we can do hand raising. I can't see John's hand. So
I'll chime in.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
When I think about the various ethical guidelines that are informing my approach to research, I realize that a lot of them have evolved and they've been tweaked over the years. AAA is a really good example where in terms of sharing data and adapting to the growth of applied and industrial research, having ethics that are really difficult to develop. And it takes a lot of time to do that. So I generally look to multiple guidelines that may emphasize different things, like the SFAA and the AAA, other guidelines, realizing a lot of time and effort went into crafting those, and that it's, the guidelines are not, something you have to follow, or you really can follow to a T. And then I also have to consider the fact that as a result of how long it takes to develop ethical guidelines, they're not going to encapsulate everything. So you might be using ethics that have been developed 10 or 15 years ago. And since then, there's been a lot of cultural change that can determine the risks that you are doing, you're facing. So for example, some of my research in tech has been academic, and that requires a lot of publishing and sharing your information. But then you have to consider the fact that the way people engage in transmitting information or interpret information, the kinds of information that are shared, particularly through social media, it leads to these other risks that you have to navigate and think through. So that's really what I think. It's a tension between realizing that a lot of time and effort went into crafting those ethics, but also that they're not going to capture everything necessarily because of how quickly society and culture can change.
Yeah, no, that's really great. So John, I may actually tag up this question with another one that came also from Alba that was around this idea of accountability that you just mentioned. And so they're asking, how can individual researchers build processes of accountability in their organizations? And now this is interesting to think about too, because I know John and Amy, you kind of work between industries as self-employed researchers. Angela, you're with an organization, so we could maybe think about it. Maybe who wants to answer this? But what does it mean, or how can individual researchers play a role in building accountability in the organization itself, especially industries that are not highly regulated with IRBs or monitored by stuff like that?
Yeah, it can't just be one person always being the squeaky wheel of hey, this isn't ethical, and here's why. If you're working as the only researcher in an organization, it might be more challenging. Maybe if you have a team, you can start to put a process in place of how to design ethical research studies, or a process to follow, so that if you recognize a team working on a deceptive pattern for a product, like an ad that doesn't look like an ad, that looks like the article you're reading on an app. Here's what we do in that case. Here's how we approach someone. If that doesn't go anywhere, then who do we go to next? What kind of alliances are there between a leader on this team, the research team, for example, or the design team, versus a leader on the product organization? So I think being clear and being in agreement on that, because John, you were saying that these things change over time, ethical codes change over time. The first code for applied anthropology was written in 1951, and I think Margaret Mead and some other famous folks were involved in that. And since then, there's been a lot of ethical codes from the Society for Applied Anthropology, NAPA, AAA, these other anthropology organizations. But we're anthropologists working in these fields. They're not anthropology. It's not the discipline of anthropology. So when I thought about my own code, I've incorporated stuff from user experience organizations, design organizations. And so we all bring these different perspectives of ethics to the table. And if we can solidify a process that we can follow in order to create accountability with others, that's ideal.
I guess my thought would be, just because there isn't one doesn't mean you're again, absolved from having to follow some kind of ethics. And then it also is a great thought that just kind of occurred to me, why can't I make one for architecture and interior design? Just because there isn't one, because historically the work's been done by expertise of architects and interior designers. They haven't had to need one, because they really haven't been engaging the user populations to the extent that myself and others who do research in the field have. So if anything, I found that in the industry and in the world of work, if you just start with one, you can always evolve it project to project to kind of hone it. And then maybe you'll eventually have something. So I was, again, my notes of just thinking, what are the things I do, and why don't I just go through the effort of codifying? And it won't be perfect, but people tend to respond better when there's something already existing, and they can say yes or no, I don't understand why, or man, this is missing, as opposed to someone feeling defeated because they have to start from scratch, or they just don't know where to begin. So I think in a way it's Alba's question's a bit of maybe a call to action, or at least that's how I'm interpreting it, to say, in my years of work in architecture and interior design, tapping into those groups and then maybe working toward creating some guidelines that would be more explicit would be good.
Yeah, totally. And I really appreciate this idea too, that there are a ton of examples of both codes, personal and organizational, out there, right? So even if one's organization doesn't have anything, or Amy, as you said too, if you're thinking as an anthropologist or a design researcher, you can actually draw from the AAA or design research or code of ethics and stuff from other organizations that already have that, right? And it isn't perfect, right? But there is, I mean, that's one of the great things. Like ethics is actually quite an organic thing, right? It isn't, we make it into a code, but really it grows with us, And so I think there's a lot of like really generative space and able to do that. And so I like this idea of like putting something out there so you can push against it, right? It really makes a difference versus just saying we should be more ethical. It's like, well, what does that what does that mean, right?
Yeah. I mean, we have new
Someone's
technology
questioned it. Yeah.
that we've never had to even consider. And now we need to like, stay up to date on that stuff and go, okay, here's this new thing. How do we make sure that's covered in our guidelines or our code?
Yeah, and I would say too, just having clarity. One of the things that comes to mind as a conversation with the conflicting interests question. I mean, just educating your peers as well on basic things like confidentiality and anonymity are not the same. And so when people use those terms, maybe a project team wants to engage a survey of nurses in the ICU about their COVID experience. Well, is it confidential or is it anonymous? And you need to be clear and communicate that with folks and set it up accordingly as just a way to be transparent and then also educate the team in which you're working with on what that is.
Yeah, I think that's right on. So this kind of falls into a question from Timothy where he's asking about, is there any tips that we have on how to advocate for or educate stakeholders on the value of research ethics and rigor? So this could be both, people that you are doing research with or also within your organization. So it's especially in business or design or non-academic, non-public environments where those things may sometimes come across to stakeholders or even other industry researchers as unnecessary or time-consuming, which I think we've all faced at some point. So yeah, do you have any tips of how do we advocate for or educate stakeholders on the value of research ethics and rigor?
It's funny because that's a big part of our job is to advocate even for our own job to begin with and our function within an organization. So it's really frustrating to have to do all of this because we have clear value, but it's not clear to some people. So I think that's like an added layer of complexity. Hey, we need to do research for what we're building to understand people. And also we need to do it ethically. And so qualitative research, quantitative numbers versus people and experiences. Sam Ladner in her book, Practical Ethnography, talks about a paradigm in which businesses function, thinking about data as numbers and what's provable statistically, not as much about like understanding people, qualitative data and that sort of thing. And I think it's the same idea of values, like what does the business value? What are the values that underpin decision making? So I think there's a parallel situation where you probably, changing people's values or inserting new values is really, really challenging. But I think, perhaps an easier way of doing it is going back to what John said about how do you, ethics is important for protecting an organization. Here's why. And then kind of also addressing, here's why it's important for us to treat other people ethically who are not part of the organization.
Yeah, I think in my past experiences, one thing that I've tried to do from the very beginning is just get a sense of the organization before I join it to make sure that there is some appreciation for what I can bring, not just as a researcher, but also as an anthropologist or somebody with an anthropology background. And for example, there was an organization that I did some work with, and they do a lot of research that could be very difficult for some people to do. And so I had to make sure that, refusing to do a project in a particular area or having the ability to kind of push back on a particular area would be possible, and that I was working with people who were human enough to just consider the fact that you don't want to behave in an unethical way. So there is the part where it does protect the organization, and most organizations, really big ones, care a lot about that. But then there's also that other dimension of we have to do this work and we have to work together. So let's do this in a way that we can be proud of and realize that ethics don't have to encumber us from doing work. In fact, anything that generates more of a conversation, helps us explore different ways to do things or different issues, and appealing to people's humanity, even when they have their time constraints and so on. I think that's usually effective, at least as I've encountered it.
I would say too, to think through, at minimum, it's risk mitigation to have rigor in your work, right? If you have the right people and the right processes and the right protocols for the scope of work you're trying to deliver, it at minimum risk mitigation. I think past that, it's to John's point about kind of pride in your work, but it's also credibility. I mean, nowadays people use the word research and data collection and empirical, again, in lots of ways. So sometimes I run into individuals in my industry and they say, oh yeah, we did a great research project on higher ed facilities. I'm like, awesome, what'd you do? What'd you study? Oh, well, we went online and just kind of looked around. I'm like, did you analyze social media sentiments? Like, what were you looking at? And it was just like, well, we kind of reviewed some best practice documents and we have our own industry experience. It's like, maybe, I don't know if I would call that like research with a big R, like it's kind of referencing and collating some insights. But if you really want to make substantial change within an industry or, really provocative claims, you've got to have the credibility to back it up. And it's that rigor that lets you have that confidence. So for me, a lot of times it's the good work I want to do to make myself proud, to educate my teams in a positive way, but to also serve my clients in their best interest, and then be very okay with what I'm sharing with the industry and even with my clients. For us, we liaise a lot with the real estate market when we're designing, corporate office environments. If we're going to do a study and make recommendations for how they're going to address the, social distancing in the workplace or reduced square footage for offices, because of COVID-19 and the economics we're in, I have to have really good data to back that up. If I'm about to go to a real estate department and tell them, it looks like you guys can reduce your square footage by, 30%. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of space. I have to be able to back that up. So for me, it's what you're trying to say is only as good as what you've collected and how you've been able to synthesize it.
Well, that's really powerful. And it's so much that we're just really taking seriously the narratives that we create, right? And that we both find credibility in our work and produce a credible narrative that we can then back up by, right? Are we looking at sentiment analysis? Are we talking to people, right? So actually, like kind of a dovetailing question from this, there's kind of two questions I'm lumping together here. In this broader theme of like, how do we ensure diversity of participants in our projects, right? So how do we understand there's sort of, actual, racial, ethnic, LGBTQ diversity in terms of participants, as well as like how we're framing projects that are not exclusionary. And so, I mean, you're kind of pointing in that direction, Angela, in terms of how do we, if we're doing a, an analysis of a space that's going to physically, set the way people can interact and move around. How are participants like playing into that space, right? How do they fill into that research? So I'm kind of curious about this question again. How do we think about diversity? How do we ensure diverse participation, both in terms of designing the projects, the research, as well as in participation? How has that played out in your work, either from stories or how do you think about that, or how have you seen that play out in your work?
Amy, I'd love to throw this one to you to hear from like the product side of things and maybe the service design. It hasn't, I can speak to architecture, but there hasn't been as much until recently.
Yeah, I mean, you have to just do it. You have to make sure people are included. And you do that by recruiting people who are diverse. And there are some projects where you're like, oh, there will probably be a correlation between people's experiences and their identity, whether it's an ethnic identity or gender identity, people with a disability, whatever it might be. So you can assume there will be some correlations, causations, whatever. And then there are other projects where you don't know. You're like, well, does it matter what the person's identity is? Maybe it doesn't, but you should still do it for the purpose of inclusivity, because even if it's not obvious, that will have an effect on the results, I think. something I've noticed is recruiting firms tend to sign people up to participate in research and ask them what their gender is. And it'll say male or female, which those are not genders. Those are biological sexes. So let's get that out of the way. We need to make sure we're using the correct terminology. Let's say it says male or female. That's it. So how do you even get people into your database of potential participants who don't fit outside of, what a man or a woman, that sort of identity? So that's kind of like a back end thing that needs to be fixed. And I have seen some recruiting firms doing that more often lately. So yeah, I think you just have to like think through it. And if you get people in who don't use standard kind of binary pronouns, make sure you're referring to people with their correct pronoun, the one that they want to be referred as. So just like being very purposeful throughout the entire process. And then if there are some patterns that you're discovering, then make sure to discuss those things. So you're ultimately teaching other people in your organization that there is an importance for doing this, even though it might be like a bit more difficult sometimes.
Yeah, I love that answer. Just do it. I mean, that's exactly right. And I just want to say that this was not sponsored by Nike or DocuSign, but that's exactly right. The fact is it's difficult, but it's important, especially when you're dealing with technology. Gender, ethnicity, identity, sense of self, all of those things come into play when it comes to the issues that we explore as researchers. I would also say educate yourself, because there's so much work in the space right now. And it's something that I care a lot about. It's something that I think about in terms of my primary research. And, I have to think about it with a whole bunch of other stuff. And so there are people who have dedicated their careers to addressing these issues. So for example, right now I'm reading a book called Race After Technology by Ruha Benjamin. And she's become a leading public intellectual on this area as it relates to how to design inclusive products and some of the hazards of not doing so. And so, yeah, I would say just do it, do the work. Sometimes you'll have to recruit yourself to do that if you're working with recruiters who don't really have that, top of mind. But also push back when you can, because it needs to be top of mind for everything right now, because it's really for the good of the work. But also, realize that there are a lot of people who are doing a lot of really, really good work, like Dr. Benjamin. So check out, some of the other resources that are kind of coming to the forefront.
Totally, and we can put books like this on the Mindshare, so folks can check them out too. Sorry, go ahead.
So thinking through architecture and interior design, it's a bit different in that you're dealing with manifested realities, right? Like digital, it's its own nuances. With architecture, we run into different things where it's not always self-identified, right? You're not always answering a survey. You might be asked to participate in a focus group or get interviewed. So in the podcast I mentioned, HR really is a good resource for how to appropriately identify subgroups within a population and appropriate ways that they might be engaged. A couple interesting kind of anecdotes from architecture is to think through how people can even engage with the questions you're asking them. So I do a lot of my research with floor plans. Well, that's assuming that someone has the visual acuity to see a floor plan if I'm trying to speak with them and get their feedback, but also can spatially understand a floor plan. So oftentimes I'll have, trace paper and pens, and I'll let people sketch and draw. Anything that's really multimodal. And sometimes it gets even as far as we'll do full-scale mock-ups of space so that people can go in and give feedback on the layout of the space. This feels too small. Okay, tell me what about it feels too small. Or, oh man, this piece of equipment, if I'm in a hospital, is in a completely wrong spot. So it's a very interesting way to engage people out of the traditional methods. And that's what Amy mentioned earlier is, we're dealing with things that really aren't within the general wheelhouse of academic training, but it's very exciting to invite folks in using different methods and means And for the concept of representation, sometimes it won't be me that goes on site to take pictures. I will actually solicit pictures from the employee base or from the staff base and say, take a picture of a space that allows you to rest and recharge. It's not me going to the break room and taking a picture of the break room and saying, oh, this must be the recharge and rest space. Or, other prompts like that, where it's not me putting my hopefully minimal assumptions onto space and how it's used and perceived, but they can then share their own, and in a safe way that doesn't should there be any criticism or they feel uncomfortable with what they're submitting. So I would say those kind of the multimodal, thinking about different capabilities that people have. And then one thing that's relatively new within architecture, which is such a shame that it's newer, is that it's the diversity and inclusion conversation. Architecture and interior design. I'm sorry, I won't rant for more than 1 minute, but it's very skewed with who's in it. And I know that the tech industry also experiences similar issues with the diversity inclusion. So at HKS, we have a group called JEDI. Again, not sponsored by the Star Wars enterprise, but it's called Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And it's our small but growing group of champions within the organization and industry to try and figure out how to engage people in different ways and to invite them into conversations they might not otherwise be invited to. So again, maybe HRs within organizations have something similar, or that there's other channels to tap into. But definitely something to be looking at as things move forward to engaging populations more.
Well, that's fantastic. And I'm pretty sure that's what Jedis do also, so that works out really well.
Good point.
So just as a final wrap-up question, there's actually a ton of really great conversations on the thread that are actually talking about, like, digging into more of this. So one thing just to say, folks, like, we'll do one more question here live, and then we'll still be on par, now and also in the future too, to keep the conversation going on Mindshare, which is one of the reasons that we use this platform, because there's so much great stuff. We are posting really cool readings and ethics guidelines and stuff like that. So yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah. So one thing I just wanted to say is this is dialogical, and we have a lot of really, really brilliant experts on the platform. So if you see a question, don't just think that it's just us. If you see a question or a comment or something you can contribute to, please feel free to answer that and use this as a discussion thread, not necessarily like a Q&A for a panel, because really we should all be a panel, because looking at the people who are here, we've surpassed 400 registrations. This is time for us to all kind of share our ideas and our expertise with each other, because that's how we're going to address the really dicey problems that we're going to have as society changes.
Yes, and just one more thing on that. We've had calls from anthropologists who have been in the discipline for many decades and who have worked on ethics to say, hey, let's continue the conversation and actually see, like what you're just saying, John, make some change. But these are people who have worked on actual codes of ethics in the discipline who still have issues with how they're described.
Yeah, right on. That's fantastic. So yes, conversations are encouraged, right? Sure, we have a panel right here, but really, we're all the panel together, the panel people. So just a final wrap-up question. I know, because we're kind of at time, so if folks are cool, we'll do one more question and then we'll wrap it up. But so Amy, I would love this question from John Sarmiento, and he asked, can you share a recent story when your personal definition of ethics or its application seemed to noticeably evolve, big or small? What about it changed?
Yes. I've always had this foundation of ethics from anthropology. It's been this it's in my brain. I was trained in it. It's kind of like, I know red flags. I know how to make decisions, whatever. But as I've switched to being a consultant and working for myself and thinking a bit more about how I do this with my clients, I've gotten a lot more specific and drawn from other disciplines, as I mentioned before, in terms of creating my own code of ethics, which I just posted on my blog at anthropologizing.com. It is open source, open access, so anyone is free to use it. But doing an exercise like that helped me articulate how that's evolved for me over time, and how to practice it, how to think about things, what my role is. For a specific example, yes, actually just last week on LinkedIn, I made a post about something I learned about, which was a research team at a company starting to do in-person research again during a global pandemic. And I completely disagree with that because of the exponential potential of harm that could be inflicted, whether it's an illness or a death or whatever it may be. And that's the way I think about it. I see it very black and white at this point because of the nature and velocity of this situation. So I posted, I said what I had to say about it. I kind of wish I had phrased it more as a question to have a conversation, but people did have a conversation. It seemed like most people agreed, but there were a couple folks who said, here's why I think it's okay to do this. We had some kind of debate back and forth. I still just disagreed, but we made our points. We agreed to disagree. And what I've realized is I can't totally control whatever other people do, even if I believe there's like a certain code of ethics. If I discuss it with other people, ultimately it's other people's decision. And so I think that's important to remember. Another person who contributed to that conversation said, like, I need to support my family right now. I need to make money. My kids are in college. I need to pay my mortgage, all of that. And that's a very different situation than what I'm in, which is I live by myself. I have work coming in. I have like a low risk situation, and I can do research on the computer basically. So just reminding ourselves that there are so many like infinite situations that we can find ourselves in, and it's easy to like make judgments about what other people do. And we can still have our opinions about it, but it's good to maybe understand the nuances of people's situations and tease those out before we make like a conclusion about how ethical they are, essentially.
Right on. Does Angela or John want to share a story too? You're not required to. I'm just curious.
I think in the podcast I shared a story of being a young researcher and not really knowing the way. Experience is a beautiful and sometimes painful teacher. But yes, that story in particular still sticks with me. That's probably been 5 or 6 years ago now. The other story I would probably share is just one about teammates within my own organization coming to me and asking me, hey, we need this really quick. Can you do this thing for us, this research thing, I'll just say. And I was like, we really just we don't have enough data to really confidently produce anything. Can we ask for more time? No, it has to be done. I said, I don't know if we can do this. And I eventually had to convince my teammates that I wasn't going to do it. It wasn't something I could confidently produce. I wouldn't feel proud of. And also it just didn't feel substantial enough. And, it's hard when you push back on your own peers, your own teammates. You want people to come to you. It's a very large firm, to come to me for advice and to help them inform work. But I want to make sure that it's good work. So in that moment, it was hard, and it was very much a temptation to say, I want to, what does it take to get to yes? But I did have to kind of hold strong and say, I just don't think this is right until we have more time and we can figure out an appropriate way to get insights to generate this, to inform design decisions. So yeah, that was definitely a tough one for me.
Yeah, I guess my example would actually be the one that I referenced in the conversation. Setting a big science project in a very dynamic environment. I have recently thought through it a bit, and I realized that one of the major contributions of that work, particularly to the field of anthropology, as we evolve our ethics to account for societal and technological change, would require me to be more public about how I talk about this, including talking about it using my name and talking a bit about the background of that research. So that's going to be something that I'm going to be doing. So it does create some additional risk, but then it's on me to mitigate that risk, but also think through how I can talk about my work in a public way now that I understand it much more, which basically required me to do a whole lot more research. So that's kind of how my ethics have evolved recently, realizing that the contribution sometimes can't be made fully unless you are taking on some additional risks. And so then it's on you to address that risk in a very proactive way.
Cool. So I just want to say, Angela, Amy, and John, thank you so much for doing the panel with us today and speaking and sharing your wisdom and experiences. And thank you to everybody on the forum who has been participating and sharing stories. There's really, really wonderful conversation threads happening there. The four of us will also be engaging in these throughout the days too. So we could basically be the social science Reddit. Don't tell anyone that, but we'll do it. But I think it's really, again, this is just about, we call it Mindshare because the idea is that we are sharing expertise and stories with each other, because that's really, you are the community of experts. So thank you so much for joining us today. This has been an enlightening and fun conversation. I want to let you know that we have our next Mindshare event coming up next week. And it is called Higher Ed is Dead, Long Live Higher Ed, ? And this is actually about how can higher ed stay relevant in an era of unprecedented change. And I think, really interesting sounding conversation, because as you may know, a lot of universities are going through really, really strange times right now, and a lot of them may not be open in the next 2 years. So we have, what's that?
We have one on Tuesday as well, Zoom and Gloom.
Also one on Tuesday. We'll post these in the forum thing below. See, I can't even remember now, right? But anyway, so everybody, thanks for joining us. It's been great to talk with you. As I said in the beginning too, the podcast of this conversation will also be available on This Anthro Life. So check out thisanthrolife.org, subscribe. You'll get the extended edition, kind of like, a Michael Bay Transformers movie with extra explosions. That sounds terrible. But anyway, but thank you all again for joining, and we will see you all next time. Cheers.
Thank you, Adam.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, John. Thanks,